To help us better analyze the situation, we're joined by Henry Rogers, a fellow at the New Lines Institute, live from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Rogers. Now, the United States carried out strikes on Iran for 13 consecutive nights. What is Washington's strategic objective, and does the administration believe sustained military pressure can still produce a diplomatic outcome?
Well, thank you for having me. And let me first start by saying that it's become very evident that military strikes against Iranian security assets, which menace the Strait of Hormuz and attempt to monopolize freedom of navigation over it, is a plan that is not feasible. It's not able or possible to wipe out Iran's capabilities to fully monopolize or menace the Strait of Hormuz. What Washington's strategic objective is, and its imperative is to apply pressure to the Iranian regime for its legitimacy against the strikes, but also against the Iranian economy, attempting to gain leverage when it returns to the negotiating table after this most recent round of strikes. So it's attempting to use military pressure against the Iranian economy to then derive diplomatic gains and pressure when it comes to the next round of negotiations.
So Qatar has called on both the United States and Iran to implement the Memorandum of Understanding and ensure freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, something that you just emphasized. So is Washington prepared to support renewed diplomacy while military operations continue?
Well, this recent round of escalation, the goal is, as I just said, to gain more diplomatic leverage at the table. But throughout this conflict, we've repeatedly seen these gray areas where we've had diplomatic meetings going on between intermediaries, but also some light kinetic action. Right now, at this level of strikes that Washington is carrying out against Iran, it's unlikely to see serious diplomatic talks in the public eye. However, as always, there are subtle diplomatic signals being passed back and forth between both sides. We can assume that these signals are being passed directly through the strikes, but also through intermediaries, while not in the public eye. So yes, I think Washington, as always, is open to that backdoor, that back channel conversation with Iran. However, the high profile talks we've seen previously, such as the Memorandum of Understanding, right now will not be seen until this heightened round of strikes is over.
So Iran is coordinating closely with Russia and China through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. How concerned is Washington about the growing cooperation among these three powers?
Well, Washington is, of course, concerned, and a large see these Washington intelligence sources releasing information about Russian collaboration in the striking of CIA sites, as well as discussions about the Chinese being involved in the negotiations, is because Washington wants to apply more pressure to those behind-the-scene actors, those powerful patrons that have been supporting Iran, not just through this conflict, but for decades since the revolution. And so Washington feels it's vital to cut that support off and make Iran feel more isolated from a military standpoint, from an economic standpoint, as discussed it before. That's really vital to their strategy. And both Russia and China have to make calculated decisions whether they gain more from the destabilization of the United States versus the pressure that the United States can bring to bear against them, whether that's in U.S. support for Ukraine or U.S. economic pressure against China, or the economic gains. So, for example, Russia has considerable benefits from the conflict, as the increased price of oil is a boon for their ability to make profits off their oil exports, despite Ukrainian hampering of those exports. China, on the other hand, suffers economically because of the ability for it to receive oil that it traditionally has received from the Iranians. But both are clearly making a concerted effort right now to lower their level of support for Iran because the U.S. has applied pressure against them and are making the calculus that it's more beneficial. But long story short, yes, Washington sees this as a linchpin to this next stage of its strategy.
So now with Gulf states, they are calling for restraint, and also the United Nations warning of a wider regional conflict. What realistic options remain for the United States to prevent maybe confrontation from escalating further, especially following the call of Gulf countries?
Well, when we see this widening of the war, especially with the Houthis being involved in this latest round of escalation and their pressure against the Saudis, the Iran strategy for escalation has clearly been to bring in its proxies one by one, not all at once, to wage this longer war of attrition against the United States, against the global economy, and the pressure that applies to the United States. So the Iranians will continue to cycle those proxies in and out, and the pressure that they can apply to whether that be the Hezbollah on Israel, the Houthis on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the global economy. But the capability for widening the war beyond that, Iran has discussed the possibility of striking United Kingdom bases for their support of the United States. However, that is mostly rhetoric, as to bring in another highly developed military power against it in this conflict would be very detrimental. So what I will say is the escalation will continue, but the widening has hit a bit of a ceiling. The US, to contain that, I believe it is unlikely that the US resume strikes against the Houthis as they did at the beginning of the Trump administration, just because of the difficulty of that air campaign and the inefficiency of that air campaign that the US realized. But also, by involving the Houthis further through those strikes, it would therefore involve them to blockade all shipments, not just Saudi shipments. So the United States' main ability to contain the conflict is to continue its pressure against the Iranians specifically, isolating and cutting off the Iranians. And I believe that's what we're going to continue to see, is that's what the US benefits most from.
So, Mr. Rogers, Iran said that it is not instructing the Houthis to give threats or to attack shipping. So what's your comment about that?
Yeah, of course, Iran is going to say that. The Houthis and Iran have a unique relationship where the Houthis are the most autonomous of Iran's proxies, not receiving as much direct funding, very little, but receiving weapon shipments that it then turns into influence and profit. And the command and control between the Iranians and the Houthis has been relatively severed due to the conflict and Iran's need to hunker down, provide more resilience for its command and control structure, but struggling. However, the Iranians and the Houthis are linked, are working together, and the Houthis to take such an escalatory behavior against the Saudis, it's an extremely aggressive action that benefits Iran far more than it benefits the Houthis, who've maintained relatively unscathed in the conflict so far. Iran is, of course, going to use rhetoric and signal that it is not the escalatory power. The United States is the escalatory power. But we now have intelligence coming out that IRGC commanders, Iranian technology, weapons, and funding was recently flown to Sana'a intentionally, Sana'a at first, and then had to divert because of Saudi airstrikes. Yes, Iran and the Houthis have denied that these weapon shipments and these advisors were sent to the Houthis. However, Iran's denied having a relationship or supplying the Houthis with weapons for decades. And they benefit more on the global scene through being received as the victim and not the one perpetrating their half of the escalation, if that makes sense.
Mr. Hani Rogers, thank you so much for being with us on Asia One.